Welcome to the Unpacking Biblical Truth podcast, where through our Bible teaching series, we unravel the layers of biblical truth, one episode at a time. Let's journey together through the depths of Scripture. Here's Pastor Gomez.
Thank you for joining us in our study of the book of Genesis. Today we're in Genesis chapter 25. Last time we saw the selection of a bride for Isaac. We saw the way the servant went and found the bride. And we saw the parallel and typology of the church and Christ. We also saw the father's desire for a bride for his son. We saw how the bride was divinely met and chosen and then lavished with gifts. And then she's entrusted into the care of the servant until she meets her bridegroom. And it's a beautiful picture for us as we are the bride of Christ. In chapter 25 now, we're going to continue to look at Abraham's life, and we're going to see some genealogies take place, and we'll ultimately see Abraham's death and burial. We begin now in Genesis chapter 25, beginning in verse 1, where it says, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Leumim. And the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Ibidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Here we see the generations that are going on, and you'll remember that Sarah has died, and so Abraham's remarried now, and these are the various descendants that come from this union. So verse 5 goes on to say, And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which he had. And while he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac, his son, to the country of the east. Here we see that the inheritance still goes to Isaac. Isaac is the child of promise, and he gets the inheritance. And we see that the others received gifts, and they were sent away from Isaac. And Abraham's careful to set Isaac apart. And in verse 7 it says, This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his son Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass, after the death of Abraham, that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahai Roi. Here we see that Abraham breathes his last, and he passes from the scene. Abraham's the father of our faith, and we see that he's very important and one of the key men of the Bible. And he's mentioned in the New Testament 70 times. And we see that his life ends and he's buried with his wife Sarah in the grave that he purchased. And there he's laid to rest. In verse 12 it goes on to say, Now this is a genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservant, bore to Abraham. You remember that Ishmael was the work of the flesh. This was the child that Abraham tried to help God along with. And these are his descendants in verse 13. And these were the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael, Nebajoth, then Kedar, Adbil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these were their names by their towns and their settlements, 12 princes according to their nations. These were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt, as you go towards Assyria. He died in the presence of all his brethren. So we've been given the genealogy of Ishmael, and now we'll see Isaac's descendants. In verse 19, it says, "This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife, because she was barren." Now, as we begin the genealogy of Isaac, it says that Abraham begot Isaac, and then there's this barrenness. There's no child after Isaac. And he pleads with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And you would think that the child of promise would step into his promise so easily. You would think that God's will for your life would be something that should just flow out with ease, and that you should just walk right into it without any problem. But it's not so. There's always opposition to the things of God. God has a perfect plan, and there's always opposition that tries to come against that. There's always going to be spiritual warfare and trials that are going to be in your life. And God, he allows those trials, and he brings us through these trials. And we see that Isaac is crying out to the Lord in his trial, just like Abraham cried out to the Lord, and God didn't deliver it immediately. There was a waiting period. There was this time of waiting on God and trusting him to work it all out. I want you to know that God is concerned with your character and your relationship with him. And so it would serve us well to pause for a moment and ask ourselves, how are we doing with the Lord? How's our walk going, and how's our relationship with him going? Are we trusting him? Are we relying upon him? Here we see that the child of promise is going to struggle to have his own child. And so it says that, "And the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, 'If all is well, why am I like this?' So she went to inquire of the Lord." Here we see that Rebekah gets pregnant, but it's not an easy pregnancy. And so she goes and she seeks God. And we see that this trial in her life drove her to seek the Lord for what's going on in her life. And God answers her. Verse 23 says, "And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the other shall serve the younger." Here we see that within Rebekah's womb are 2 nations struggling with each other. And we saw how Abraham fostered 2 nations as well. We see Ishmael and Isaac. And now underneath Isaac, we see that 2 nations are going to be born as well. And it shows that God chose one of them over the other. It says that the older is going to serve the younger. Both of these nations or children are going to be different from one another. It says that one is going to be stronger than the other. And these 2 are not going to get along. Now, Jacob and Esau are the 2 children that are inside of her womb. And the Edomites are the ones that are going to come from Esau. And the Edomite nation did in fact come to an end. And the last known Edomite came from the family of King Herod. King Herod was the one who had all the babies destroyed in Bethlehem, all the baby boys. And the Edomites throughout history were always antagonistic towards God's people, against God's plans and purposes as well. So when God's people were coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, they wanted to pass through the Edomites' land in order to get to the land that God had promised them. And the Edomites came out against them to keep them from coming through. And so this is the characteristic of Esau from the very beginning. Esau, he didn't care about the things of God. He was an outdoorsman. He was a hunter, a rough and rugged kind of a guy. He wasn't one to lean on God, and he wasn't one who needed anybody else. He was his own man, and he used to love to sing that Frank Sinatra song, "I Did It My Way." And in that, he lacked a relationship with the true and living God. And we see here that God foreknew the two characters that were battling inside their mother's womb. There was the one who despised spiritual things, and the other was spiritually sensitive. And through God's infinite wisdom, he chooses the one who's spiritually sensitive. And he says that the older shall serve the younger. Verse 24 goes on to say, "So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them." So here we have these two boys being born, and one of them was a hairy little guy. And you have to remember that Isaac, he was 40 years old when he took Rebekah for his wife. And here it says that he's 60 years old when she gives birth to twins. So there was a 20-year barrenness and waiting for the promise of God in their life. And now that the one comes out and they name him Esau, his name means red, and it refers to the hairiness of the firstborn child. And then out comes Jacob. And his name also fits him because his name means heel catcher or deceiver. And he always wants to hold on to the heel. He always wants to cut a deal. And he likes to manipulate words. And God, he's going to have to change his character. Verse 27. "So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob." Here we see that Jacob was a mama's boy, and they had favorites within the family. May this be a warning to us. As parents, we're not to love one child over the other, and we're not to have our favorite child. And here we see that this is what's going on in the family here. Isaac, he loved his firstborn Esau, and Rebekah, she loved her little Jacob. Verse 29 says, "Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, 'Please feed me with the same red stew, for I am weary.' Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, 'Sell me your birthright as of this day.' And Esau said, 'Look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me?'" Here we see that Jacob knows that the birthright is valuable. He knew that the son of the birthright would have a double portion in his blessing, and that he'd have honor and become the family leader. And Jacob, he tries to use his brother's hunger to his advantage so that he could gain his birthright. But the interesting thing is that God already declared that it was his. So Jacob doesn't need to help God along in this. And we see that he resorts to his own flesh. He resorts to scheming and plotting and deception. And we see that when he does this, there's always going to be a cost to a work done in the flesh. There's always a consequence when we're operating in our flesh. And even when we get our desired object, when we do it in the flesh, there's always going to be a side payment that's going to be due because of it. What God's going to deliver in the spirit, Jacob, he takes in the flesh. And this is the same mistake that Abraham makes when he takes Hagar and Ishmael is born. And he makes the mistake of helping God along instead of sitting quietly and waiting on the Lord. So God, he's going to accomplish his perfect will in your life. And you don't need to reach into the flesh. You don't need to manipulate the circumstances. And you don't need to operate in your own wisdom and in the power of your own might. You just simply need to obey God and wait on the Lord. And he's going to bring his purpose to come to pass. So we see that Esau's hungry and asks for a bowl of stew. And Jacob anticipated it and says, well, what about that birthright? And Esau, he doesn't place any value on these kinds of things. When the family is discussing theology, Esau would rather be watching ESPN or the fishing channel. And verse 33 says, then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank and arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. We see here that while Jacob is guilty of scheming, Esau is also to blame for not putting a value on what God values. We see that he takes and despises his birthright. And every single time that we as children of God walk in the flesh, we do the exact same thing as Esau. God has a great blessing for us. But those blessings are only going to come to us as we walk in the Spirit. And when we walk in the flesh and fulfill the lusts of the flesh, what we're doing is we're handing over and forfeiting our blessing and perfect will of God for our lives. The flesh and the spirit are in constant battle for our soul. They're forever warring against each other. So the Bible tells us that if you walk in the spirit, you won't fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And Esau was more concerned with fulfilling the lusts of the flesh than he was in receiving the spiritual blessings that were available. May we learn this lesson in our lives. Although we might not be settling for a literal bowl of lentils and a piece of bread, but every single time we trade the greater for the lesser, when we exchange a piece of the spiritual for the physical, then we also are making the same choice that Esau made. We are sons and daughters of the King, and he's called us to a high and holy living. And when we despise our birthright, when we go after the things of the flesh, when we live that way, the way the world lives, then we're living like Esau. And I want to encourage you and just say that God is calling us to a better life, a more blessed life than that. While I hope this study has ministered to you and finds you well, and now may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.